the 90s, also known as the age of the internet and the beginning of a complete skyrocket in the way that everybody looked at and viewed information. And alongside all this new and kind of frightening change, you had new horror tropes emerge in the 1990s, once again playing off of society's very real fears and anxieties of what was going on. Hey, how you doing? It is I, the Terrific Lady, otherwise known as Brandy, and welcome to Retro Horror School. If you remember in my video about tropes from the 1970s, I talked about how it laid the groundwork for the horror tropes of the 1980s. And now we have a lot of tropes from the 70s and the 80s being turned on their heads in the 90s. I will talk about 6 horror tropes and themes from the 1990s, the context behind them, and why they connected so well with audiences. Here we go. Self-referential slashers. The 1980s was an era of explosion for horror movies, and most notably the era of the slasher film. But by the time the 80s were over, people were suffering from a bit of slasher fatigue. They had seen slasher upon sequel upon sequel upon franchise. So what happened? You have horror films coming in and turning the subgenre of slasher completely on its head. Films like Scream, which came out in 1996, and I Know What You Did Last Summer, which came out in 1997, turned the slasher subgenre on its head by poking fun at the horror genre itself. For instance, Randy's speech about the 3 rules to successfully survive a horror movie.
There are certain rules that one must abide by in order to successfully survive a horror movie. For instance, number 1, you can never have sex. No. Big no-no! Big no!
I'm a dead man.
Sex equals death, okay? Number 2, you can never drink or do drugs. No. The sin factor. It's a sin. It's an extension of number 1. And number 3, never, ever, ever, under any circumstances, say, I'll be right back. Because you won't be back.
Those are the rules that you will often find in very early horror movies of the 70s and even the 80s. Films of that type actively called out the cliches, poked fun at them, almost like giving a wink and a nudge to the audience, and letting the audience know, hey, like, you're in on the joke too. Here you go. Tortured teen protagonists. In the 1990s, you had members of Gen X and older millennials like myself coming of age. And a lot of high school slashers reflected people and characters who were the same age as us. They were high schoolers going through high school related problems, like what grade they got on the test, what date they were going to have for Friday night, who the hell was going to take them to prom. Very real. They may seem silly to us now, but at the time, when we were teenagers in high school, these are very real problems. And a lot of high school slashers reflected that, on top of the fact, oh no, there's monsters and creatures and psychos that want to stalk and kill us. On top of all the other high school problems that we have, now we have that in those kinds of horror movies, at least. So also, in addition to this portrayal of teenagers that you saw in horror movies, you had very scary events happening during that time. School shootings like Columbine, missing children, and killers that targeted kids were leading to this perception that youth and adolescents were overall, during the 90s especially, very dangerous. So this kind of horror trope theme about the tortured teen protagonist not only focused on the monsters and creatures wanting to lay waste and destroy the teenagers, and also focused on the issue of perhaps innocence and carefree times of being a teen being torn away from them far too soon. On screen, terror seemed to lurk behind every corner and was present at every party and every school dance. Movies like The Craft and The Faculty had teens dealing with high school problems and now being stalked by psychos, creatures, and monsters. Romantic gothic atmospheres. Many genre films of the 1990s, such as Bram Stoker's Dracula, Interview with a Vampire, and Sleepy Hollow, reflected elegance with the costumes, the production design, the dialects, and much more. Not only into a wider adoption of and revival of the steampunk style and the Victorian interior design style, but also a bit of a longing for what is considered an era of beauty and grace and elegance and decadence. So you had this dark kind of gothic vibe and romanticism that offered a bit of an escape from things and pieces of technology like computers and cell phone towers that you would see everywhere. And you were starting to get a computer in every home. You could not escape technology. So this kind of romantic gothic style that you would see in certain horror films of the time offered a form of escape. And flirtations with this kind of style also led back to the 1990s kind of rave and club scene that was going on at the time. So you had films like The Crow and Blade that were reflecting this kind of style and the rave and club subculture directly on screen. Psychological mind trips. We have big advancements in psychology around that time. And because of this, there was an inherent curiosity of people wanting to know, why did, say, people like serial killers, what made them tick? Why did they do the things that they do? This interest and curiosity was very heavy during the 90s and also heavily made it into the mainstream. For instance, the trial of O.J. Simpson. You do not know how huge this trial was. Okay, little side story. I was 13 when this was going on, and I remember that they announced his verdict over the intercom at my school. I was in junior high. This is how much this trial permeated culture. So things like this fascinated and frightened people. And also things like repressed memories and dream analysis also made people very, very curious and wanting to know more about how the mind worked. For instance, the 1991 movie Silence of the Lambs sparked a fascination with psychological profiling of serial killers and wanting to know what made them tick. So it all comes back to, we are very curious about the inner workings of our mind. They're a big mystery. Science experiments gone wrong. In the 90s, you had a lot of genetic and scientific breakthroughs and experiments. The one that is the most famous is the cloning of Dolly the sheep. And this kind of stuff creeped out a lot of people, because then you have the question, well, how far is science allowed to go? Should humans play God? The Island of Dr. Moreau and Frankenstein heavily explored and turned stories about out of control experiments into almost like parables, stories, cautionary tales about the dangers of playing God. And most people don't consider this a horror film, but Jurassic Park delves into the same kind of concepts.
Don't you see the danger, John, inherent in what you're doing here? Genetic power is the most awesome force the planet's ever seen, but you wield it like a kid that's found his dad's gun.
I don't think you're giving us our due credit. Our scientists have done things which nobody's ever done before.
Yeah, but your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could that they didn't stop to think if they should.
Light-hearted monster mashes. In the 80s, you had a little thing called the Cold War, and post-Cold War, global tensions kind of eased up a little bit, just for a while. And with that came the nostalgia of wanting to go back to, a simpler, lighter time when things were goofy and silly and fun. Hence the Monster Mash. So you had silly kind of creature features that threw classic monsters together, just, to have a good time. For instance, Waxwork 2 Lost in Time featured creatures like werewolves, mummies, vampires, zombies. And the movie is just fun, silly, and you're meant to have a good time. This harkens back to 1948's Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, where monsters were thrown together just for fun and a few laughs. So you had horror movies that were poking fun at themselves and at the genre, exploring the nature of the human mind, or that were just silly and having a good time. No matter what trope you looked at during the 90s or what theme, 90s horror reflects the fears of that era. What is your favorite 90s horror trope from this list? Is there one that's your favorite that I did not mention? And bonus question, what is your favorite 90s horror movie? Let me know in the comments below. Class is dismissed, everybody, and I will see you next time. Bye.